Okay, so imagine this scene playing out more and more across the country. You see these large public protests, right? Maybe about the environment, maybe police actions, maybe some new policy, huge demonstrations.
Yeah, blocking highways sometimes, really visible stuff.
Exactly. But then picture the response not just being, policing on the ground, but specific new laws popping up in state legislatures, laws that seem aimed directly at these kinds of protests.
hmm It's definitely a pattern we're seeing.
So that's what we're going to get into today. We're doing a deep dive into these, well, some people call them run-over bills, kind of a provocative name, I know, but also other laws that are making it riskier or maybe even criminal to protest in certain ways,
Yeah.
especially blocking roads.
Right. And our goal here is really to unpack what these laws actually say, look at the different arguments swirling around them, the pros and cons people are raising.
And think about what it all means, really, for public protests going forward.
Yeah, the future of dissent, essentially.
Now, for this deep dive, we're mainly drawing from an audio piece by the Golden State Times. They were discussing an LA Times article that really shone a light on one particular bill in North Dakota.
But that North Dakota bill, it's really just the tip of the iceberg, it seems.
Yeah.
Part of a much bigger national picture.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We're talking about a bill that's gotten a lot of attention,
Yeah.
North Dakota House Bill 1203, but like you said, it's plugged into this much larger national conversation.
Right. And what's fascinating here is how quickly these kinds of laws seem to be popping up. One of our sources described it as happening in a moment of historical protest activity, which, I mean, that really makes you think.
It does.
It raises some pretty big questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About, balancing the right to protest with public safety, that classic tension.
Absolutely. So let's zero in on that North Dakota bill first, House Bill 1203. Now, according to the source we have, it was still in committee when they reported. And what it proposes is, well, pretty stark. It would essentially shield drivers from being sued, so no civil liability for damages,
Okay.
and potentially no criminal charges for injury or even death if they hit a protester who's blocking a road.
Wow. So legal protection for hitting a protester with your car.
Well, there are conditions. That's the crucial part. The driver's action has to be unintentional. They still have a duty to, try and slow down, see the person, avoid hitting them if possible.
Okay. So it's not a green light to just deliberately drive into people. The intent matters.
That's the letter of the proposal, yeah.
Hmm.
And it's interesting where this came from. The sponsor, Republican State Representative Keith Kempen,
Mm-hmm.
he introduced it right after the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. Apparently, he said some of his relatives got caught up in traffic blocked by protesters last fall.
Okay. So a direct personal connection there.
Yeah, he basically said, this isn't their issue. If something happened, they'd wind up being blamed.
Gotcha. So it comes from a place of wanting to protect drivers who feel threatened or trapped in those situations.
That seems to be the core motivation presented. But then there's this detail from the North Dakota Highway Patrol. Lieutenant Tom Iverson said, at least at the time of the report, he wasn't actually aware of any crashes involving vehicles hitting protesters there.
Oh, interesting. So no actual incidents sparking this, just the fear of incidents, perhaps?
Well, they have seen protesters blocking roads, and the agency has closed roads because of it, for safety. But yeah, no reported vehicle pedestrian collisions involving protesters at that point.
That context is definitely important. It highlights that tension, doesn't it, between the perceived threat and the actual documented occurrences.
Exactly. And Representative Kempen, the sponsor, he did clarify, this isn't about letting drivers intentionally target anyone. He apparently even said he doesn't think it would be used very often.
So what's his line then? Where does protest cross the line for him?
He draws it pretty clearly. He says, look, protest on the sidewalk, fine. In the ditch, fine. Road shoulder, fine. But step into the road, challenge a motorist.
Right.
He calls that an intentional act of intimidation.
Okay.
And then he uses some really strong language. He calls that the definition of terrorism. Now, we should be really clear. That's his rhetorical framing, his word choice.
Right. It's a very loaded term to use for protesters blocking traffic.
Yeah.
It really escalates the rhetoric.
It does. And the host on that Golden State Times audio source, they completely agreed with Kempen's view, like
Right.
100%.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, they basically said peaceful protests with signs on the side, fine, even if people are angry. But blocking roads, stopping people getting to work, getting home, maybe getting to an emergency,
Yeah.
they called that 100% terrorism too, because in their view, it stops being just protest and becomes combative.
So the idea is that blocking a road inherently shifts the dynamic to something aggressive, potentially violent even.
That seems to be the perspective. The GST host talked about situations where, protesters might start attacking cars, banging on windows, kicking doors, damaging property just because someone's trying to drive through.
Hmm. Creating a sense of danger for the motorist.
Exactly. And they painted this picture quite vividly, actually, to justify the bill. Imagine a mother, maybe with kids in the car, suddenly surrounded, people hitting her car. She's terrified for her life, her kid's life.
Yeah, scary scenario.
So she panics, she hits the gas to get away. Without a bill like this, if she accidentally hits someone, she could be sued, maybe face charges.
Okay.
But with this bill, the argument goes she'd be protected because her actions were driven by, justifiable fear for her safety and her family's.
Right. That's a powerful argument, framing it around self-preservation in a moment of perceived threat.
It is. But then you have the other side looking at these exact same proposals with, frankly, alarm.
Yeah, what are the counter-arguments? Because
Okay.
that interpretation is stark.
Well, you have activists like Dallas Goldtooth from the Indigenous Environmental Network, who was involved in the Standing Rock protests. He called this North Dakota bill part of a terrifying progression.
Terrifying progression.
His take is that what this bill actually does, its effect, is to basically give people permission to potentially kill someone, just because that person is standing in the road holding a sign.
Wow. So framing it not as protecting scared drivers, but as legitimizing violence against protesters exercising their rights, even if unconventionally.
That's exactly the fear. It's a completely different lens on the same proposed law. So how do these concerns, from activists, from groups like the ACLU, tie into broader rights? What's their specific legal or constitutional objection?
Well, Lee Rowland, who's a senior staff attorney at the ACLU, adds another layer. He notes, like we said before, that we're in this moment of historical protest activity.
Right.
And he finds it really troubling that the legislative response seems to be punishing that speech rather than, say, engaging in dialogue about the issues being protested.
So the concern is less about the specifics of road blocking and more about the government response to dissent itself.
Exactly. The big worry from the ACLU perspective is the potential chilling effect. If protesting, even peacefully assembling, carried these heightened risks of liability or even physical harm, shielded by law, will people still feel safe exercising their First Amendment rights?
That makes sense. It could definitely make people think twice.
Yeah, it potentially discourages public demonstration altogether.
And crucially, this isn't just North Dakota, right? You mentioned it was part of a bigger trend.
Absolutely. The source material was very clear on that. North Dakota's bill might be grabbing headlines, but it's described as just one of a raft of new pieces of legislation popping up elsewhere.
Which other states are we talking about?
Well, the list mentioned included places like Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Virginia, and Washington State. So it's pretty widespread geographically.
Wow. Okay. And are these all basically the same kind of bill focused on driver liability like North Dakota's?
No, actually, and that's what's really interesting. They seem to be trying different tactics to achieve a similar goal, which is controlling or deterring these kinds of protests.
Okay, like what are the different approaches?
So while North Dakota is looking at driver liability, a state like Iowa, for example, was apparently considering much higher fines and potential jail time specifically for blocking roads.
So focusing on punishing the protester directly through criminal penalties.
Right. And then maybe a state like Virginia might be looking at tweaking existing laws,
Right.
like broadening the definition of obstruction, which could give police more power to clear demonstrations faster, maybe arrest people more easily.
Gotcha. So different mechanisms, civil liability shields, increased criminal penalties, broader police powers, but all kind of pointing in the same direction.
It seems that way. A varied toolkit, you could say, but part of a concerted legislative push in response to protests, particularly those disrupting traffic or infrastructure.
And this is all happening, as we've said, at a time when we've seen huge demonstrations about all sorts of major issues, pipelines, police violence, national politics.
Exactly. The context of increased protest activity seems undeniable.
It really does feel like a potentially pivotal moment for how public assembly works in this country. So let's try and synthesize this a bit. We've dug into these so-called run-over bills and other related laws, and there's this really clear, strong tension at the heart of it all, isn't there?
Definitely. On one side, you have the stated legislative goal: protect drivers, keep traffic moving, ensure public safety, framed often around preventing chaos or responding to perceived threats.
Right. And proponents, like we heard, might see blocking roads not just as inconvenient, but as aggressive, intimidating, even using words like terrorism to describe it.
Yeah, that framing is powerful.
Mm.
But then on the other side, you have deep, deep concerns about fundamental rights, about free speech, about the right to assemble peacefully.
And the fear that these laws aren't really about safety, but about silencing dissent, particularly effective or disruptive dissent. And I mean, the potential for really severe outcomes for protesters is central to that fear.
Absolutely. Opponents see these laws as dangerous, potentially enabling violence against people simply for being in a public space, to make a point. It's a stark difference in perspective.
So why should you, listening right now, care about this? I mean, regardless of how you personally feel about blocking roads as a protest tactic.
Right, whether you support it or oppose it.
These laws could fundamentally change the rules of engagement for public discourse, for how citizens can push for change across the whole country. It's not just about North Dakota or Iowa.
Exactly. These aren't just isolated state issues. They represent a potential shift in how public space is regulated and what forms of protest are deemed acceptable, or indeed tolerable by state authorities. And, some analysts mentioned in the sources see this as potentially part of a wider political strategy.
How so?
Well, a strategy aimed at discouraging protests that cause significant disruption, maybe economic disruption or major public inconvenience, targeting the effectiveness of certain protest methods, perhaps.
That adds another complex layer to it. So, thinking about the future then, what's the big takeaway here? What's the thought we should leave people with?
Well, I think the lingering question is, if this trend continues, if lawmakers keep responding to large-scale protests with laws like these, what does that actually do to our society?
Right. How does it change things long term?
Yeah. How might it fundamentally alter the ways people feel they can express disagreement or advocate for causes they believe in? And maybe even how we understand the very concept of public space and who gets to use it and how.
That's definitely something to mull over, how these laws could reshape not just protests, but maybe the fabric of public life itself.